Good day, 5th primary students. Welcome back to Chapter 3 of Oliver Twist. Let's start. Now, before watching, don't proceed without reading and listening to the chapter carefully and preparing, of course, as we usually do. Before watching, try to answer these questions. How do you think life would be like for Oliver in London? Would you rather stay at a place in which you don't feel happy or live on the streets and try your luck? And the last one says, where do you think Oliver would be at the end of the chapter? Chapter 3, On the Streets of London. For a whole week, Oliver was on his journey to reach London. And on that journey, he met some good people who gave him some food or some water, and some who didn't. But some kind people actually tried to help Oliver when they saw how small and young he is and alone on a road on his own. When he reached London, Oliver sat on a doorstep and a boy suddenly came to talk to him. That boy's name was Jack Dawkins, and he introduced himself to Oliver, saying that his friends called him the Artful Dodger. And the word Artful Dodger comes from the word art, which means he is an artistic person, and dodger means he can avoid things easily. So far we don't know why he was called that name, but we will know later. Jack Dawkins kept talking to Oliver and asked him if he needed food or if he was hungry, if he was tired, and Oliver was all of that. Oliver was hungry and tired, and actually not just tired, very exhausted, and he wanted to eat and rest. So Jack offered to get him something to eat, and Oliver agreed at once because of how tired and hungry he is. So Jack later suggested to Oliver to take him to a place of an old man that could help him and make him or let him stay the night. Oliver thought that he could not believe his luck. Finally, he can be at rest. Someone will help him. So later, the boys went to an apartment in one of the poorest areas in the city, in London. Jack went inside that house quickly, and Oliver followed him up the stairs into a big room at the top of the house. Everything in the room was black with smoke and dirt, except only handkerchiefs. So Oliver saw some handkerchiefs hung over the wall that was very dirty and black, but those handkerchiefs were too clean for the room. And when he entered the room, he met a man who was old, had long greasy red hair, and he was cooking over the fire. And everyone in the apartment sat around him. And when Oliver and Jack arrived to the apartment, Jack introduced Oliver to Fagin. And Fagin liked the idea of seeing a young boy with no one to help. So he smiled once he met Oliver, showing long yellow teeth like a rat. So imagine if you describe a man as a rat, what would that show about him? Fagin shook Oliver's hand, and everyone else in the room did the same. They followed Fagin's footsteps and shook Oliver's hand and welcomed him very much. Oliver thought that everyone in the room was very friendly, but he thought that the room was too clean for the dirty handkerchiefs, so he stopped and stared at them and admired how they're looking, or how they looked. So Fagin noticed how Oliver admired the handkerchiefs, so he told him that they have just washed them. So they washed them like they were very, very valuable to them. Extremely valuable. All the boys laughed at that remark from Fagin, but Oliver didn't know why they were laughing. They all ate and slept on a mattress on the floor, and the next morning Oliver was the only boy to wake up late, so Fagin told him everyone was at work. Soon Jack and Charlie came back, and they gave Fagin two well-made wallets and 4 silk handkerchiefs. Fagin showed these things to Oliver, and Oliver admired the achievement of the two boys, and he immediately wanted to learn how to come home with such valuable things. Fagin suggested a game, and Oliver immediately wanted to play. He would put something valuable inside his pockets, and the boys would try to take that thing secretly. If Fagin felt a hand in his pockets or saw one of the boys, he would win. But if the boys could steal or take away the handkerchief or the valuable thing from Fagin's pocket without him noticing or seeing anything, they would win the game. Oliver was so excited to play the game with the other boys, and soon he learned how to do that. And he played with the boys, and he learned how to take out the handkerchief silently and secretly. Fagin was very pleased with Oliver's achievement. So, in the next couple of days, Fagin sent Jack, Charlie, along with Oliver, on a job on the streets. So Charlie and Jack stood watching everyone around them on the street until they spotted one old gentleman standing outside the bookshop, absorbed in the book, not feeling anything around him, and they decided that he was perfect for the job. Oliver did not understand, except when he spotted the two boys creeping on the old man in front of the bookshop and taking away or snatching the handkerchief out of his pocket. Oliver immediately realized that the boys were thieves, that he had learned how to steal from people. So he stood in shock in the middle of the street, trying to comprehend the evil behavior the little children just did. So he stopped, and when the old gentleman from the bookshop turned around, he only saw Oliver standing in the middle of the street, and Oliver felt terrified, so he started running. The old man thought that that Oliver was the one that stole his handkerchief, so he shouted, "Stop, thief!" And soon a crowd of people were running after Oliver. So Oliver was very terrified. He ran very quickly, but he fell on the street. He slipped and fell. The crowd stood around him, and the old gentleman decided that he was the boy in question, that he was the boy that stole his handkerchief. This is the theft. Okay, look at Charlie and Jack running with the handkerchief, but the old gentleman from the bookshop pointing at Oliver, saying that he was the one stealing. At that moment, the bookseller from the bookshop arrived and told the old gentleman that he had seen everything and that Oliver was an innocent boy. But by that time, because of being terrified and scared, Oliver fell unconscious on the street, and he couldn't feel a thing. When the old gentleman looked down on Oliver's pale face and his innocent, frightened eyes, he decided that he would take him home with him and get a courage to tend to his sickness. And that is the end of chapter 3. Now to the most important quotes in the chapter. The first one says, "Oh yes, sir, if you'll teach me." And these words were said by Oliver Twist to Fagin at his home, and Oliver's innocence was showed in this situation. He never understood that Fagin was a troublesome man, and the thought of Fagin being evil never crossed Oliver's mind because he never thought a man who was helping poor children could be a thief. And for the second time, Oliver's innocence led him into trouble. Because of his naivety, Oliver was pulled into the life of crime. The second quote says, "This boy is ill. Get a carriage. I'm taking him to my home." These words were said by the old gentleman from the bookshop. As we later will know, his name was Mr. Brownlow, and he said these words to the crowd on the streets because he felt guilty towards Oliver, who fell unconscious on the streets of London because of fear and exhaustion. This showed that not all people in London were immoral. Some of the rich folk in London weren't heartless and liked to help people. And a good example of those minority of charitable people was Mr. Brownlow. Now to the character sketch, and the first one we start with Jack Dawkins. And Jack Dawkins was called the Artful Dodger, and that name was given to him because of how good he was at dodging troublesome situations with the police. He was good at avoiding trouble. One of Fagin's most skilled thieves, he was sent to the streets occasionally to recruit other members like he recruited Oliver. He brought Oliver something to eat so he can take him to Fagin's place. Jack and Charlie took Oliver to the first theft on the streets of London, where Oliver was stunned to know that the boys were thieves. He abandoned Oliver on the streets with the police on his tracks just so he can save himself. Charlie Bates, he's a young member of Fagin's gang of thieves. He was always attached to Jack Dawkins and they went on jobs together. Along with Jack, they went on a theft and brought back 2 wallets and 4 silk handkerchiefs, which amazed Oliver, and Oliver wanted to learn from them. Both boys agreed to steal the handkerchief from the man reading at the bookshop. That was the moment in which Oliver understood that they were thieves. Fagin, he is the leader of one of the most dangerous gangs of thieves in London. He recruited young kids with no place to go and no one to care for, taking advantage of the fact that they were lonely on the streets. He taught Oliver stealing through a game. His wicked way of thinking had to be appealing to young children in order to hook them on stealing. An old man with long greasy red hair, he had long yellow teeth that reminded Oliver of a rat. So he described 2 characters with animals' names. The first one was Mrs. Sowerberry, and he described her as a fox, and Fagin was like a rat. He owned an apartment that was considered the headquarters of his gang. He washed and cleaned his stolen goods there, and Oliver thought such goods were too clean for the dirty room. The gentleman at the bookshop, the victim of Fagin's gang. When the boys saw him absorbed in his book, they thought that he'd be the perfect candidate for the job. When he realized he was stolen, he looked around and saw Oliver running, so he accused him of being a thief. He chased the boy until the boy fainted, and he learned the truth about the theft from the bookseller, so he felt guilty when he saw Oliver unconscious on the street. He decided to take Oliver to his home and tend to his sickness because he saw how innocent the boy looked. The last one, as always, is Oliver Twist, and he spent 7 days on the way to London, in which some kind people gave him food and drinks. When he arrived to London, his feet were bleeding and he was extremely tired. Once he met Jack Dawkins, he thought that luck had smiled upon him and sent him a kind hand to help him through his years of suffering. Because of his innocence, he never thought that Fagin and his boys were very friendly and because of his innocence, he thought that Fagin and his boys were very friendly and welcoming when they first met him. They were just trying to help him, nothing else. He never thought the game proposed to him by Fagin was to teach him stealing, so he was surprised when he saw the two boys snatching the handkerchief from the old gentleman. Being weak and exhausted, Oliver fell unconscious on the streets of London, and the situation was terrifying for the little boy. Oliver was amazed that with the effort both Charlie and Jack exerted when they brought home wallets and handkerchiefs. He wanted to be of benefit to Fagin because he didn't want to eat their food with nothing in return. That's the end of chapter 3. Thank you for listening and goodbye.